Yes, okay, welcome. This is the last session before the lock note on Friday. I bet you're all tired of hearing of other people's words. So I'm trying to be as eloquent as possible. I'm working at Knowit currently, and we have a very high-lifted slogan called "We are the makers of sustainable future," and that kind of covers a bit of the basis from what I'm going to talk about today. And I'm going to talk about how to make open source more sustainable. And a little bit about me. I'm turning 42 this year. The answer to everything, right? I've been around making front-end applications ever since 1998, when I was actually this tall. I grew fast, and I'm doing tooling and front-end stuff and framework stuff and building systems and so forth. But this is actually what I do. Because the work thing is just, something on the side. But yeah, I tend to write very rarely about stuff, but mostly I do food. But yeah. Okay, this is an open source project I have. It's not used by anyone, but it downloads like 200 times a week. And it helps you with some documentation stuff, pinpointing stuff in design systems. But I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about this, how to make open source more sustainable. And I need a classical show of hands. How many of you use open source daily? Everybody actually should raise their arm because you actually use open source daily as an end user. Every time you use your smartphone, every time you use your newest car, every time you use your TV, every time you take a flight, you use open source. How many have you contributed to open source, developing wise or design wise? Lock the lights, okay. 10, 12. And how many are you are maintainers of an open source project? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. And how many of you feel fatigued by maintaining an open source project?
It's only me who uses it.
Yeah. The thing is, there are a lot of small-time players, who like to fiddle around, have the open source project. I have like 12, and I feel it's just awful just to accept the PRs for the security updates, and that takes a lot of time, stuff like that. But I'm talking about more of the big leagues here. And just to define a little bit about open source, the open source is kind of described like the fundamental act of friendship and among programmers, and that is to share code. And Richard Stallman wrote this in his 1985 manifesto. And for those of you who don't know who Richard Stallman is, that's the guy. He's a prophet. He's the man behind GNU. GNU is basically short for GNU is not Unix. And no, that is not a real hat. That is actually one of the original IBM disks. Yeah, he used it at a lecture at the university in Oslo a couple of years ago. Now, the problem is that when you are a maintainer of open source, is that you are entering a world that is basically defining the technology industry over the last decades. And with the rise of open source, the companies and individuals have been able to collaborate and share software code, leading to the development of innovative and cutting-edge technology. However, as an open source has become more popular and widespread, the challenge of ensuring its financial sustainability has become increasingly pressing. Open source projects are typically maintained by volunteers who do not receive compensation for their contributions. While this is often seen as a part of the open source ethos, it is not a sustainable model in the long run. Open source projects also typically rely on donations and sponsorships to support their development, but these sources of funding can be unreliable and insufficient. Additionally, the challenge of generating revenue from open source projects is a constant concern of open source companies. And coming back to what I asked about, you use open source every day. One of the best examples is this. This is curl. And it is included in every almost every modern device. Smartphones, cars, TV, laptops, etc., etc. And you also have OpenSSL that has over 1.3 billion installations. They have 638 contributors and 18 maintainers, while curl only have 8 maintainers. I mean, for crying out loud, we landed the helicopter on Mars. We operated that helicopter from Earth with open source code, Norwegian code. And that's the Mars Ingenuity helicopter. And open source projects are more and more often victims of their own success. Those responsible for the packages end up spending thousands of hours a year maintaining and supporting packages that exists in the global infrastructure. This can lead to a burnout and the lack of resources for maintaining and updating these projects. Absolutely free, and usually only with outrage as the open source world salary, it is not sustainable, not in the long run. This is a massive challenge across both companies and national borders. We as developers are definitely in a position where we can contribute, but what is really the right way to do it? I'll try to answer it. And the first thing we have to do is to recognize that it's a problem. I'm going to take up a few examples to the problem. Have anyone heard of Lerna? Yes, anyone heard of monorepo? Lerna was one of the biggest contenders for handling a monorepo, and the developer was one guy, maintainer, one guy. Suddenly you just saw the issues to stack up and stack up and stack up, and none of them was answered by the maintainer. And this is not the only project that has come to this end of life. Luckily, that project got continued because an organization stepped in and covered both the contribution part and the maintainer part and the cost of it. But things like this creates this kind of symptom patches. Either a self-sustained project that actually checks if another project is maintained. So you go to that site, check out or you enter the GitHub URL for the project. Is it maintained? And then look at the activity on it and see, okay, it's properly not maintained. And one of the biggest cases is this. Does anyone remember this one? Yeah. Basically, it's 13 lines of code you can have written yourself, looking at you developers. Package on NPM. NPM did some tomfoolery with a company in the United States. The original maintainer was forced to let go of a name of another component, and then the maintainer of that 13 lines of code was so furious, so he pulled that package from NPM, resulting in a Y2K-like problem, which really hit. That was worse than Log4j. And the thing is that discontinuing open source project can have significantly ramifications. Open source software is often integrated into many other systems. Moreover, it can leave users and organizations without support for security updates, which can result in increased security risks and decreased stability. In short, it can have far-reaching consequences and can undermine the sustainability of an open source ecosystem as a whole. It is important for open source projects to have a sustainable funding and support, as well as clear governance and maintenance policies to minimize the risk of discontinuation. Now, so what can be done to ensure the financial sustainability? Because that's easy, you can just toss money at the problem, but the financial part is just a small part of it. To answer this question, we need to consider several crucial questions. I'm really running out of time now. How can we secure funding for open source projects? How can we ensure that open source developers are fairly compensated for their contributions? And I'm not just talking about monetary compensation here. How can we measure the value of open source contributions? And how can we encourage more people to contribute to open source projects? Like we have to have incentives. We have to have the reason to contribute. And how can we balance the need for financial sustainability with the principles of open source? And how can we ensure open source projects are inclusive and accessible to all? DEI, anyone? So the solution to how can we secure funding for open source project, you need to develop a model for compensating open source developers. And that is not just strictly financial. I mean, have it in your contract. You can work so many days a week on an open source project. You can contribute, etc., etc. You need to secure reliable funding sources for open source projects. I mean, if your company, let's say Facebook, earns like what, $10 bazillion a month, at least pay something back. And you need to measure the value of open source contribution. Like the track metrics as the number of contributors, the amount of code contributed, or the impact the open source project has had on the community. And one good idea is this one that GitHub came up, the GitHub sponsors. Yes, it will help the most visited and most used project, but it gives the small guys actually a chance. And how can we encourage more people to contribute to open source project? Well, you need to encourage people by creating a welcoming and inclusive environment. And you can, like in a small way, do like the bounty source, for example. You can have hackathons or meetups in your local cluster. Or Hacktoberfest is pretty cool. That encouraged me as a developer to contribute, actually, because you get badges, right? How can we balance the need for financial stability with the principles of open source? I'm going to skip ahead because I have a short of time. You need to balance it by making sure that open source projects remain transparent, accessible, and free for everyone to use. And it's important for open source projects to have sustainable funding and support, as well as clear governance and maintenance policies to minimize the risk of discontinuation. Now, is open source a part of making a sustainable future? Yes, no, no, yes, yes, okay, not. Well, the UN certainly thinks so, because last week, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, they actually released the 8th set of open source principle or directives. That's pretty good. Now, they claim, or they state that open source code should be open by default, making open source the standard approach for project. We should contribute back by encouraging active participation in the open source ecosystem. What I just said, secure by design, making security priority in all software project. You should foster inclusive participation, design for reusability, provide documentation, empowering individuals, and sustain and scale to support the development of solutions to meet the evolving needs of the UN system and beyond. And what you can do to support open source is actually be part of the open source initiative. This is not a begging round to send money there, but you can actually contribute, get the badge, register as a member to be part of this community. Now, yes, open source can be part of making a sustainable future by promoting transparency and collaboration. Open source software can lead to more efficient and sustainable use of resources. Additionally, open source projects can bring people together from all over the world to work on creating solutions which can result in more sustainable and eco-friendly technology. The ability to customize and tailor open source software to individual needs can also reduce waste and contribute to sustainability goals. Overall, open source has the potential to play a significant role in creating a more sustainable future, because we are the makers of a sustainable future. Thank you.